This evening, we will start with opening remarks and a presentation from EPA Region 8 Water Division about its preliminary determinations. Following the presentation, we'll take a short break, and during that break, we will have a question and answer session down front that will be an informal question and answer. We ask that you only ask procedural, factual, or follow-up questions that you may have about the presentation. The Q&A session will not be recorded or transcribed and will be completely off the record, as it is intended to be an informal venue for you to ask some questions that might better inform your official comment that will be on the record. Please note that EPA has already responded to substantive questions received from the town of Afton and the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality in past discussions in writing, and it's on the record, and that can be also found in the docket. They are in Appendix A within the decision document. For the remainder of the time after the break, we will open for participants to provide on-the-record comments on EPA's preliminary determinations. Based on the number of people that have signed up to speak this evening, we may have some extra time for participants to come back up, but we are going to limit it to 1 time per person in the interest of time. Each speaker will have 5 minutes for their comments. This will ensure maximum participation and allotment of adequate time for speakers. If your time runs out and you have more to say, then we may be able to get back to you. But you can also submit your comments in one of the 3 ways that we talked about earlier. If there are any local media present, you may see Laura Jenkins in the back. Please remember to silence your cell phones. We want to make sure that everything is going to be transcribed very well, so we have to keep this room extremely quiet. Now I would like to introduce Darcy O'Connor. She's the Director of EPA's Region 8 Water Division.
Thanks so much, Jane. And good evening, everyone. Welcome. It's really wonderful that you all made time in your busy schedules to be here this evening. We really appreciate it, your participation. It means a lot to us. Thank you. As Jane said, my name is Darcy O'Connor. I'm the Water Division Director at EPA Region 8. So I'm out of Denver, Colorado. Region 8 includes 6 states. That's Wyoming, Colorado, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Utah. And within the Water Division, we either oversee work with our partners in the states who implement or oversee water programs. In some areas, we do our own direct implementation. I have actually been with EPA for a little over 24 years, which I think I understand now is the age of this school, so that's kind of nice. I've spent all my time in Region 8, and I have done most of my work in the water program. So again, as Jay just explained, the purpose of the meeting tonight is really to share information about EPA's preliminary determination for the periodic spring and obtain your comments and input on these proposed decisions. The periodic spring is a very unique geologic feature which has been used by Afton as a water supply for many years. EPA is proposing 2 determinations for the periodic spring. One, that the spring is what is called groundwater under direct influence of surface water, and that filtration is required. EPA has reviewed available information about the spring in making these determinations, and we have worked with the town of Afton and with the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality throughout this process. Prior to making these preliminary determinations, we met several times with the town of Afton and Wyoming DEQ to discuss our concerns and what information is available about the periodic spring. We will provide a summary of that information tonight. The EPA docket contains several reports and other information that you can review, including a decision document that spells out in much more detail how we made these preliminary determinations. We welcome any additional information that you can provide about the spring that will help us make our final determinations, as well as your thoughts about the process, the information, and the data that we use to make these preliminary determinations. EPA, the state of Wyoming, and the town of Afton share a common goal of ensuring that residents here have a safe supply of drinking water for years to come. I appreciate you all coming out tonight to learn more about this issue, provide your input, and help us reach a final decision. Thanks for coming. I'd now like to turn it over to Lisa Kahn to provide an overview of the issues and information involved in EPA's preliminary determinations for the periodic spring. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lisa Kahn, and I'm a supervisor at EPA Region 8's Drinking Water Program. I've been in this role for 10 years, and like Darcy, I've been working for EPA for 24 years, and 23 of those years I've spent working in drinking water issues. I co-manage a group of scientists and engineers who oversee the drinking water programs in the 6 states that Darcy mentioned in our Region 8, as well as the Native American Indian tribes that exist in those 6 states. And our mission is to ensure that the drinking water provided to the public within these states and the Indian tribes is safe and complies with the National Safe Drinking Water health requirements. As you know, unsafe drinking water can cause many serious short-term and long-term health problems for people that are drinking the water. So EPA has a very special role in working with Wyoming water systems. We oversee the 771 public water systems in Wyoming to ensure that they provide safe water to the public, both the people that live in Wyoming and all of the various visitors that come through the state. And many people have asked us, why do Wyoming water systems have to work with EPA? Why don't we work with the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality? And the answer is that Wyoming has not requested authority to implement this program. And it is the only state in the country that does not have that authority. So what do we do with Wyoming water systems? We review the sampling results that the Wyoming water systems are required to collect on a routine basis just to ensure that their water supply meets the safe drinking water health criteria. We conduct on-site sanitary surveys to review the water system facilities and their operations to make sure things are going well. We provide compliance assistance and training to water system operators, providing a lot of assistance over the phone and by email just to make sure that the water operators know what requirements they need to meet to ensure safe drinking water. That's probably the most time-intensive thing that we do, is just truly try to work with Wyoming operators. We also respond to various issues at water systems, various contamination incidents and other emergencies and general issues that arise with water systems and many other activities. We review all the groundwater drinking water sources, including springs, every 3 to 5 years through our sanitary survey process. And we treat all sources and all water systems the same. We do have consistent processes in our work. Now, the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality does have important roles to play also with Wyoming water systems. For instance, if a community wants to build a new storage tank or expand their distribution lines, then they would get a permit from Wyoming DEQ district engineers and work specifically with Wyoming DEQ on that permitting process for water system facilities. They also manage the state operator certification programs, ensuring that the operators of community water systems in Wyoming are certified and have all the necessary training. And they assist with providing funding to water systems using various state and federal funds. So why does EPA have concerns about the periodic spring? And as you know, the periodic spring does supply the major source of water for the town of Afton. And EPA has received various reports of high turbidity in the periodic spring water. Now, turbidity is the cloudiness that may exist in water that's caused by particles that is in the water. And there were some high incidents of turbidity in 2003, and then again in 2007. And in 2007, we did collect some sampling, trying to find out where that turbidity came from, but we never found out where the turbidity comes from. When EPA was reviewing Afton's 2014 sanitary survey, again, we were trying to figure out where does this turbidity come from and where does the source of that water come from that goes to the periodic spring. So at that time, we were reviewing a lot of existing data, whatever reports we could find about the periodic spring, and just trying to figure it out, because really turbidity in a protected spring source should not spike up like that. Groundwater sources should be pretty constant with a lot of their water quality parameters. At that time, we also reviewed a 1990 University of Wyoming study, specifically of the periodic spring. And so during that study, the researchers collected specific water quality data of the periodic spring during the spring and the summer of 1989 and 1990. And that provided the most site-specific information that we've seen about the periodic spring. And that report raised concerns about the safety of Afton's water supply. In 2018, EPA started working with Wyoming DEQ to try to better understand the periodic spring, and we were sharing ideas back and forth about what kind of data collection might be helpful to try to understand their turbidity and where that water supply comes from. Then in December of 2018, we met with Afton and Wyoming DEQ, and we developed a plan for the next steps of how can we find out more about the periodic spring. And at that meeting, we agreed that EPA would collect MPA samples, and I'll talk some more about MPAs in a little bit. We also agreed that Afton would provide some of their existing data that they had collected on temperature and pressure, which relates to the flow of the periodic spring. So they provided that data to Wyoming DEQ to evaluate, along with other available information. And then DEQ created a hydrogeologic report about the periodic spring and provided that report to Afton and to EPA in March of 2020. And we reviewed that report in addition to other available information in making our preliminary determinations that we're talking about tonight. And EPA wrote a 23-page evaluation of that DEQ report. So if you're interested in knowing EPA's thoughts about the DEQ report, you can find that in Appendix K of the documents that are on the docket. So I wanted to show you just this quick video. It's just a minute and a half on the periodic spring. This was made from the University of Wyoming Extension. And it shows how very unique the periodic spring is. You know, we haven't heard of any other water supply in the country that uses a spring source like this that cycles on and off. So it's extremely unique. So let's see if this is going to work.
Welcome to Intermittent Spring, or as the Native Americans called it, the spring that breathes. This unique land feature is located just 5 miles east of Afton and is definitely worth the hike to check out. Periodic springs are relatively uncommon compared to continuously flowing springs, and the one located here in Star Valley is the largest in the world. According to University of Utah researchers, the theory to how this works is groundwater flows continuously into a cavern underground, and as it fills, it pours over a high point in a narrow tube, which creates a siphoning effect. This sucks the water out of the chamber, but eventually air rushes in and breaks the siphon. Here at Intermittent Spring, water flows for 12 to 18 minutes and then stops for approximately the same amount of time. In the spring, the flow never stops due to increased water supply from melting snowpack. At full flow, the spring discharges 285 gallons per second and is Afton's chief water supply. So the next time you're in the Star Valley, head east on 2nd Avenue through the town of Afton to reach one of the world's only rhythmic springs. From the University of Wyoming Extension, I'm Ashley Garles, exploring the nature of Wyoming.
questions is, where does the water come from that flows out of the periodic spring? EPA reviewed a 1987 Wyoming Geological Association report that says that the flow originates from recent rain or snowmelt from the recharge area that's several miles to the east of Afton. But that exact location of the recharge area is not known. And for those who are wondering, a recharge area is where water soaks into the ground and flows through the rock and eventually exits at the periodic spring. Now this, I'm not sure you can see it too well. The town of Afton is on the left side. You can kind of see the yellow road going north and south. That's the town of Afton. There you go, it's a little bit better. In the flatlands, and then you can see the National Forest, the mountains in the National Forest going up to the east. And the periodic spring is about 4.5 miles or so to the east, up. I'm sure a lot of you have seen that. And then the University or the Wyoming Geological Association folks say that probably the major recharge area for the periodic spring is in about 4 miles east of there. And you can kind of see there's like a whitish area going north and south. That's one part of the National Forest up there. It's possible that the water soaks into the ground up there and flows down to the periodic spring. But it's also possible that there are other places within the mountains there that provide water to the periodic spring that are closer to the spring. So how long does it take the water to soak into the ground and discharge from the spring? That University of Wyoming study says that it could just take a few weeks from when it falls to the ground in the recharge area and comes through the mountain to the periodic spring. And that report also said that there's evidence of karst geology in that area of the mountains. And karst is where the geology is made out of limestone, and that stone is dissolved, and it forms channels and tunnels in the rock that allows water to flow very swiftly through the rock, through the limestone. And this diagram here, it shows where the rain and the snow is falling up in the upper lands, and then it soaks into the ground and moves through the various layers of rock and soil to discharge to the surface wherever there's an opening for the water to discharge to the surface in the spring. And normally, normal groundwater moves very slowly through the cracks and in between soil and rock particles. But the difference with the karst geology is that the water moves very swiftly through these channels. So let's talk now about the issues that we're here to talk about tonight. EPA's proposal for 2 determinations for the periodic spring. The first one is that the periodic spring is considered groundwater under the direct influence of surface water, or GWIDI. And the second preliminary determination is that filtration is required to remove harmful surface water organisms in the water. So what is GWIDI? GWIDI is defined in the law in the National Primary Drinking Water Regulations as 2 different ways. One is any water beneath the surface of the ground with significant occurrence of insects or other microorganisms, algae, or large diameter pathogens, such as Giardia lamblia or Cryptosporidium. So that's part 1 of the definition, and part 2 is a significant and relatively rapid shifts in water characteristics such as turbidity, temperature, conductivity, or pH, which closely correlate to climatological or surface water conditions. Now, the national regulations require every state, and for the state of Wyoming, that means the EPA, to evaluate each groundwater and spring source to determine if they are under the influence of surface water, using national and state criteria. And those evaluations can be done based on site-specific measures of water quality, or well construction, and geology evaluations. So the Afton periodic spring meets both aspects of that GWIDI definition. We've seen a significant occurrence of green algae and diatoms, which meets part 1 of that definition, as well as significant and relatively rapid shifts in water characteristics, such as turbidity and temperature. which goes along with part 2 of that definition. Now, greedy water supplies have a direct connection to surface water source, or it can have a rapid flow of water from the surface of the ground to the water source, such as through rain or snow melt. Now, in contrast to weedy and surface water supplies, a normal groundwater system, a well is drilled usually several hundred feet deep into the ground through various layers of rock and soil down to a water-bearing zone, hopefully a couple hundred feet deep. And that's where the pump in the well draws that water in from those deep layers and brings it up through the well to the surface to be used as a water supply. So that's a typical groundwater well. Now a greedy well, the kind of commonly considered greedy well, could be one that's drilled more shallowly near a river, for instance. And so the pump draws water up from those shallow layers, and it could actually be drawing water up in from the bottom of the river up into the water supply. So that could be actually drawing surface water from the river up into the well. And so that's not considered a groundwater well, that's called a groundwater under the direct influence of surface water well. Now the periodic spring is currently regulated as a groundwater, like as if it was a groundwater well, even though it really isn't. It's quite unique. So a surface water influence makes that water source vulnerable to contamination from pathogens that live in the surface water, like Giardia and Cryptosporidium. And that is EPA's primary concern, and that is our mission to protect public health. Now, no one drinks water directly from a river or from a lake, because you know that there's harmful pathogens and you often would get sick, if you drink directly from a surface water supply. So that is the issue that we're talking about here today. Now, Giardia and Cryptosporidium do cause serious health effects, from diarrhea and nausea to even death, and especially for people that have a weakened immune system. Now, the federal regulations require surface water and greedy systems to use filtration to remove those pathogens, or else meet some specific conditions. Now, Afton treats all of their different water sources with disinfection. And so the question is, if Afton treats its water, why are we concerned? And the chlorine treatment used by Afton has shown to effectively kill any bacteria that might be in the water supply. And Afton has had safe monthly bacteriological sample results for quite a long time. However, EPA found different organisms in Afton's water supply in the sampling that we did. And these organisms travel through in the same way as these surface water pathogens. And pathogens like Cryptosporidium and Giardia are not killed by chlorine, and they do require additional treatment. So EPA regulations and guidance outline 2 types of information that can be used to determine if a groundwater source is weedy under the direct influence of surface water. So the first one, the EPA and many states across the country use as a primary means of determining weedy status, is to see if a significant occurrence of surface water organisms exist. And that's through the use of microscopic particulate analysis samples, or MPA. And that's where you go to that water source, you collect 500 to 1,000 gallons of the raw water, not treated water, and as you're gathering that water, you're running it through a filter in the field. And then you take that filter, send it to the laboratory, and then the laboratory analyst will look at the organisms on that filter with a microscope, and they'll actually count the number of specific types of species and organisms that are on that filter from the raw water supply. And they determine if surface water organisms like diatoms and other green algae exist on that filter at significant levels. And these organisms only grow in the presence of sunlight. They use photosynthesis that turns them green, so they're not expected in a groundwater supply. So the second part of the greedy definition is where you can collect water quality parameters, different water quality data. Usually collecting it at frequent intervals over a period of time. So you can collect temperature, you can collect turbidity, which again is the cloudiness in a water supply caused by particles in the water. You can look at pH, which is how acidic or basic the water is. You can look at conductivity, that measures minerals dissolved in the water. And you compare that data you've collected for that water source to climate or surface water conditions to see if there's a rapid recharge of that water source or a hydrologic connection to surface water. So groundwater is not expected to see variations in these parameters because it's normally collected deep underground and it's fairly constant. So you wouldn't expect to see a lot of variations in these parameters. So what data did EPA use to create this preliminary WEDI determination for the periodic spring? Well, we did collect MPA samples, and we looked at data and reports of elevated seasonal turbidity in the periodic spring. We looked at the temperature of the spring's water and how it correlates to higher water flows coming out of the periodic spring at certain times of the year, and the timing of snow melt up in that recharge area. And also the likely existence of that karst geology where there's a system of the cracks and the channels in the rock that carry water and possibly contamination from the recharge area to the spring. Now we followed EPA's standard policy for doing this WEDI evaluation like we do for other water systems. And wherever we did deviate from that policy or practice, we've documented the reasons for that change. And that's found in some of the documents on the docket. So let's talk about MPAs. So as agreed back when we met with DEQ and Afton in December of 2018, EPA collected MPA samples in September of 2019, and those samples showed a moderate risk of surface water influence. It found the presence of live surface water organisms. And then according to EPA's policy, if you have a moderate result, then you collect another MPA again. And so we collected another MPA in August of 2021. And that sample showed a high risk of surface water influence. It showed a significant presence of live surface water organisms. And there is a whole national criteria and chart of how many organisms have to be present to score a moderate risk and how much presence of organisms, specific organisms, have to be a high risk. And so so both of the samples from the periodic spring showed green algae and diatoms. And again, they do require sunlight to grow, so they're only found in surface water. Now, the organisms may be present seasonally, such as when the snow melt moves through the mountain to exit through the periodic spring during that certain time of snow melt and transport. So MPAs that are collected during other times of the year may not show these organisms. It's very common for MPA samples collected at different times to have different results. We see that all over the country. You don't always see a high MPA result whenever you take an MPA in a particular water system because organisms can just be there seasonally. Or also because maybe the water is too cold to grow organisms. They are living organisms that have a certain temperature range that they live in. Or also perhaps recent rain or snow melt no longer feeds the periodic spring. So it's not uncommon to see a variation in MPA results over time. So here's a photo of the mouth of the spring where the water flows out of the mountain. And there's a concrete structure, and you can kind of see a flapper door there. There's a series of flapper doors there. So Afton's water supply pipe is behind these doors underneath that concrete structure, and it collects the water that comes out of the mountain and takes it down the pipeline, down the hill, and then to the Afton treatment plant. And those doors are there. They are like swinging doors. So when the water is pouring out, well, first of all, whatever water is in the mountain goes to the town of Afton's water supply pipe, and any excess water, additional water, flows out through those doors, so the doors swing open, and then that water flows down the creek and eventually joins the Swift Creek. When the water stops flowing, when the spring is going periodically, those doors swing shut. And based on information provided by Afton and our own observations, we have not seen any pools of water that are outside of this structure in front of those doors. When the water is not flowing, the water flows away when the water stops flowing. So we have no indication that the algae and the diatoms that were found in the MPAs come from this specific location at the mouth of the spring. And as a separate and distinct issue, EPA required Afton to make improvements to those swinging doors a few years ago when it was clear that the doors were not staying shut. And the main concern there is that insects and animals that are hanging out around the spring could just climb through there, through the cracks in the doors that were not shut, and go in there and possibly get into the Afton water supply. So as you can see, I don't know if you can see in this picture, this was before the improvements were made, but one of the doors is propped open when the water is not flowing. But Afton did make improvements to these flapper doors last year. So now to address the second part of the GWEDI definition, looking for seasonal changes of water quality at the spring. So as I mentioned before, there have been multiple reports of high turbidity occurring seasonally at the periodic spring, including in 2007, when there was high turbidity of more than 90 nephelometric turbidity units. And turbidity in groundwater sources is typically less than 1 NTU. So we were pretty alarmed when there was 90 NTU showing up in the periodic spring. Now, the turbidity of groundwater sources is normally constant and does not vary according to the season. But surface water turbidity definitely can vary, and you can see that after a rain or when there's runoff, the color of a river can change. You can see lots of turbidity in a surface water source like a river, but you don't expect that to see in groundwater supplies. Another aspect was temperature of the periodic spring. And data from the University of Wyoming and the data that Afton had collected show that there are seasonal changes in the temperature of the water flowing out of the periodic spring. And that change in temperature correlates to the flow of water from the spring. So during the spring and early summer, you see high flows of cold water pouring out of the spring. And at that time, the spring is not periodically flowing, it's flowing all the time, it's not stopping. And that 1990 University of Wyoming study says that the spring discharges appear to be directly influenced by climatic conditions such as snowmelt. Also, there's possible geologic impacts on the flow of surface water. As I mentioned before, the periodic spring is located within the Madison limestone geologic formation, where there can be large cracks and channels that the water can swiftly flow from the recharge area to get to the periodic spring, and harmful surface water organisms could be rapidly transported to the periodic spring. As that report said, it could be just within a matter of a couple of weeks. So that was our first preliminary determination that the periodic spring is a GWEDI, groundwater under the influence of surface water. Now our second preliminary determination is that filtration is required to address that surface water influence. So the federal regulations require GWEDI systems to install filtration to remove and inactivate contaminants that exist in surface water. And filtration is required because harmful pathogens can stick to the particles in high turbidity water, making disinfection with chlorine less effective. And as I mentioned before, some of these pathogens are not killed by chlorine. And filtration is the best way of reducing turbidity from a water supply. The federal regulations allow GWEDI systems to avoid filtration if they meet certain conditions, such as having constant low turbidity, conducting extensive monitoring of the water supply, and having additional forms of disinfection besides chlorination. Oops. So what is the information that EPA used to make this preliminary filtration determination? So we required the preliminary decision to require Afton to install filtration was made because filtration avoidance is not allowed for water sources that have turbidity greater than 5 NTU. And as we saw before, Afton has had turbidity as high as 90 NTU. And also to avoid filtration, Afton would be required to create and maintain a watershed control program to protect that recharge area up in the National Forest. But again, that location is unknown. And once any of the filtration filtration avoidance criteria is not met, that would trigger Afton to be required to install filtration. So that concludes my very brief overview of EPA's preliminary determinations. And we're going to move to the next part of this event tonight, where we do seek your public comments on the preliminary GWIDI and filtration determinations and the rationale and data that EPA used. And of course, your comments will be transcribed. Your oral comments will be transcribed for the record, and your written comments will be transcribed. You can give written comments to the registration table. And we do have a large amount of information in our online docket with lots of reports, much more information than I was able to describe today. But it also includes, in our docket, it includes the EPA's preliminary technical evaluation decision document that has been mentioned before. We also have copies of that at the registration table. I'm not sure how many copies we have left. But that document really explains in more detail how we came to these preliminary determinations. And we also have a lot of other reports and information on our docket. So after this public comment hearing, we're going to review all the submitted comments that have been provided, and we'll consider all of those comments, and we will provide a written response to those comments, and we'll put a transcript of the hearing and a response to comments document and our final determinations. All those things will be posted on that online docket. And when we do post the determinations and the hearing transcripts and the response to comments, when we post all that on the docket, we will notify anybody that gave us an email address when you registered here or when you submitted written comments. And so we'll notify you when this information is available on the docket, and we'll also announce it through social media and other ways. So we just really thank you, and again, the deadline for submitting comments is October 4th, and we hope that we hear from you. Thank you.